Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Simone Cavallaro. I'm the director of the Stigler Center. We are happy to host Brian for a two-day mini course on corporate political influence in the US. Brian has been at the Stigler Center as a visiting scholar for a few months now. Thanks, Brian, for joining us. As usual, I'd like to remind you that we are on the record, live streaming, so please silence your phones. Also, the views expressed by individuals we host are their own, not one of the Stigler Centers or the University of Chicago. This is our last public event this academic year, but please check our website for full updates this summer. As you may know, the Stigler Center promotes and disseminates research on regulatory capture and the various distortions that special interest groups impose on capitalism. There is one particular initiative that I'd like to highlight. This year, we released a new podcast, Capitalism, hosted by Luigi Zingales and Kate Waldock, on what works and what doesn't in capitalism today. If you haven't already, please check it out and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Back to today's topic. We look forward to hearing Brian's insight into corporate-linked money. Tomorrow at lunch, for the second portion of this seminar, he will speak on alternative sources of influence for corporations. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce Brian. Brian is visiting us from UT Austin's Meckham School of Business, where he is an assistant professor in the Business, Government, and Society department. He received his PhD from UCLA Anderson School of Management, a master's from UCSD's School of Global Policy and Strategy, and his SB from MIT Sloan School of Management. Outside of academia, he's worked in both the public and the private sector, in the US and abroad. At UT Austin, he teaches courses on corporate social responsibility and business and politics. Please join me in welcoming Brian Richter.
So thanks for having me, and thanks to the Stigler Center actually for not just having me today, but for the last couple of months. I've gotten a lot out of being here, I think, and hopefully people around here get something out of me being here, and hopefully it's as much as I've gotten out of it, if not more. So this is a unique opportunity to actually talk about research in a different way, because academics, we spend a lot of time sitting there by ourselves, thinking about small details of things, and the type of research I do often gets very much into the weeds or the corner of things, which hopefully by the end of today you'll be convinced matter, at least when we're thinking about how corporate political influence works. It's easy to say a lot of high-level things, but we often don't understand the details, and particularly when it comes to money and politics, when we read what the media has to say, we often don't even understand what they're talking about because they use terms that we don't know what they mean, and even among academics who are in closely linked areas, we'll see that people use the term lobbying to mean something that's at least different than a legal definition, or campaign contributions, we don't really understand what they are, what the difference between a PAC and a super PAC is. So hopefully we'll get into those types of topics. I'm going to try to finish in about 50 minutes, so we have about 10 minutes for questions on anything at the end, and can open it up too. So to get started, kind of the big question in this space is really, is there too much money in politics? Or is there too little money in politics? So I'm pretty sure if I polled the room, we're not going to look like these people because we're in a business school setting, so not that many of you are going and protesting this. But we would end up closer to where public opinion is, which is generally that there's a sense that there's too much money in politics, and this makes people very angry. And in particular, this is sort of bubbled up after the Citizens United court decision in 2010. Which allowed for independent expenditures, which I'll briefly talk about, but I don't really research myself. So when you poll people, almost 80% of people on average, regardless of party, think there's too much money in politics. And we tend to believe that, and there's activist groups that have sort of focused on Citizens United, which allowed corporate treasuries to spend money on things called independent expenditures, which essentially amount to campaign ads. And there's a movement to repeal that, even to set up an amendment to disallow that. And so there's tremendous view that this is a bad thing, that money shouldn't exist in politics. Certainly there's too much of it. we're here. This is Stigler. We're at the Stigler Center event, so I feel like I almost need to put this up. And Stigler came along in the 70s and had a very big insight in the way public policy worked, which is very different than the prior view. It's almost hard to imagine for probably a lot of people in the room that prior to the 70s, people really believed that bureaucrats did things in the public interest. Politicians were only doing things in the public interest. There was no real sense of corruption, and these people were supposed to be professionals and getting done the right thing. And so coming along and saying that industry is actually determining regulation was a very new thing, and it changed the way a lot of academics think. I wouldn't be here, obviously, if people didn't start thinking this way or researching to this end, right? So there's this idea again that there's too much money in politics. That said, there is a long history to this. So I bet at you if I asked you prior to coming in here, is corporate money allowed in politics? Almost all of you would have said yes. In fact, there actually hasn't been corporate money in politics since 1907. So there's a thing called the Tillman Act that banned corporate treasuries from spending their own money out of corporate treasury on corporate politics. And so this goes back a long time, and this isn't the first time that we've seen kind of a movement against the sort of question of is there too much money in politics? And so there is sort of a historic analog that goes back a really long time, over 100 years. So not new stuff. Then on the other side of things, we end up with this guy who Luigi might be the only person in the room who could identify from a picture, but this is Gordon Tullock. And he's posed what's really kind of a famous puzzle in political economy or political economy research, which is essentially why isn't there more money in corporate politics? And so that may seem like a weird question based on where public sentiment is today and where everything's coming along. He said this basically right after Stigler came along and said, all policy is designed by a politician or by firms. And so this is kind of one of the key organizing questions about firms and politics. So how does he get here? And he gets there by saying, look, the value of government policies to firms is really large, right? It's this really big dollar amount if we start quantifying that, and then we can look at the amount of money that we know firms are spending on politics, and that's actually really small. And so if we thought about this as an investment, the returns are going to be way too high because we've got this really small denominator, really large numerator in calculating the return, so the return's really high, right? So we can make that a little bit more formal. Tullock also comes along and says, hey, these are risky investments, right? It's not like you give money to politicians and you get what you want 100% of the time, but you can think about it as like rolling the dice. I mean, obviously, there's strategy and other things that go behind how firms want to spend money on politics. We're not going to get into all of that today. I do teach like a semester-long class on that and ways to sort of get voice across. But the bigger picture point is that not every time that you spend money on politics, it's going to work. But even still, right? So that's going to reduce what the potential benefits are in the numerator here. But there's still a small amount of money in politics, and so. He plugged in basic numbers. I've updated these to a more recent election cycle. So he was using numbers from the 70s when we first had disclosure on campaign contributions. But given the size of the federal budget, given how much firms spend on politics, and even if you assume that it's only 1 in 100 chance that if you spend money on politics, we'd still have over a 500% return on any investment in politics if we're going to just look at campaign contributions. And so looking around the room at a bunch of MBA students, and all of you would take that, right? I mean, if you get a 500% return on anything, and every firm should be spending money on politics. Reality is this isn't true. There's only about 10% of firms actually lobby, only about 15% of publicly traded firms that are registered to lobby at least, and there's a much smaller number that actually even have PACs, which are political action committees for campaign contributions. And so we know there's not that much money in politics, and we don't fully know why, but we want to start dissecting this more. Right? So this is incredibly high return. Firms should be doing this if their government benefits are available, and so we should actually expect more money in politics. And so this is kind of a way to organize things or thoughts about a lot of the research that I have done. So most Americans are going to be more consistent with what Stigler would say here, which is everything that firms are getting comes from what they want in terms of regulations and what the government can give them. not really thinking about necessarily constraints on why or how that works. But there's also a lot of economists that think there should be more money spent on politics, essentially, if the returns are this high. And so unpacking this is what we want to do. Both sides tend to, these are high-level thoughts, right? And this is actually one of the great things about Stigler Center and Stigler is that there's these big thoughts, and we talk about stuff that's important, but there's still room to understand or need to understand the details of how this stuff works. And so we're going to get into what are different ways that firms actually do spend money on politics. How do we even know these are ways that firms spend money on politics? How's it regulated, and kind of where these fuzzy lines are, sort of getting us towards quantifying it. So how much money is actually spent is tricky, but again, this is sort of the denominator. So today we're going to focus on kind of the denominator, how much money is spent on politics. And then tomorrow, if you come back, I think we're actually going to get into more interesting research in some ways, at least to me, because it's newer. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today is new too, but we're going to be focusing on the numerator more, how much, what the benefits are, who the benefits go to, and sort of why. So, what are the channels? How's it regulated? Are there leakages around the channels given how it's regulated? Another thing the Stigler Center focuses on a lot is regulation. And money in politics is regulated. And when we have regulation, people get creative on how to avoid it. And then, given all of that, can we even quantify it at all? And if we ballpark it, is that going to get us towards an answer to the Tullock paradox? And is there the right amount of money? Is there too much money? Is there too little money? So, kind of an outline for the bigger picture channels of money in politics is there's corporate linked PAC spending. This is what academics have focused on for the longest period of time. Then there's sort of personal contributions that can come from individuals, CEOs in particular. I do a lot of research on. Then there's lobbying expenditures, charitable donations, and then there's all sorts of other stuff that you've heard about, things like independent expenditures and super PACs have made the news a lot recently. They don't leave as explicit receipts, so they're harder to talk about, but that's part of the point and part of the issue here. So campaign contributions, and what are they? This is the thing that's sort of been most available for the longest, which is making a contribution in the name of free speech to a candidate. Right, and so it's really an instrument for involvement in electoral politics, right? So I can give money to a candidate for office. That candidate for office can use the money how they see fit, right? They can pay to drive to some part of their district or a district they're running in, to host a campaign event, to run ads on TVs, all these types of things. And so it's a cash transfer to a political candidate's coffer, right? And it has to be used for electioneering. It can take on various forms, and we're going to get into the distinctions between these, but there's a corporate linked PAC, which again isn't corporate treasurer money, but we'll get into that. And then there's sort of personal money from individuals who can be linked to corporations or any individual can give. The vast majority of money, actually all money, comes from individuals. If it goes from a corporate PAC, it actually was from an individual, but we'll talk about that. Lobbying is an order of magnitude larger, the amount of money spent on lobbying. And most academics actually think about it as an instrument for involvement in legislative politics instead of electoral politics, right? And so there's no explicit cash transfer that happens in lobbying between a firm and a politician. It is the firm's treasury money that's spent on it, though. We tend to think about it as actually the provision of information. So you can make persuasive arguments, and can you spend money employing people to make persuasive arguments? And there's obviously stuff that happens on the edges of it that is regulated, but one way to think about this is sort of a time subsidy to politicians and their staffers, and this is about what happens in particular bills, rather than who gets elected for office. And then that doesn't mean that it's not helpful to campaigns, right? Because you can get information on a policy that's going to be relevant to voters in your district, and that may be the information you want to know if you're going to vote a certain way on a bill. Maybe like the relevant information, but it's still information nonetheless. It tends to happen through lobbying. Lobbyists can also get paid by their lobbying firm, leave office, and leave that and go volunteer on campaigns. So there are a number of loopholes around it that start looking more like campaigns, and there's a blurry line between the two. The most blurry line here is charitable contributions, because we tend to think about this as sort of public goods provision, and we might want charities to be able to spend money on politics. And this is the area that's probably the most newly studied, because at face value, money comes from a corporate foundation, like it looks like a donation to a charitable cause, but we can tell, and we'll get into research on how it's actually targeted towards specific politicians, and there may be increases in it when firms are more interested in politics. So, obviously there are other channels. I've mentioned Citizens United. So independent expenditures and what Citizens United is widely misunderstood. But essentially this is a channel for firms to be able to spend money to run ads that are technically supposed to be uncoordinated with a campaign. There are certain ways to hide it. But it's really hard to track. And so it's going to be harder to talk about simply for that reason, but it exists. It's also, given that it's harder to track, harder to claim explicit credit for having done it. We're making it obvious that you've done it. So we're going to start out, digging in a little bit more on contributions from facts. So academics have looked at this for a long time. And this is kind of this classic problem of we have data, right? And so, the light's shining over here, the key's over in the corner, and maybe academics have been studying the wrong thing for a variety of reasons, and there's a long literature on this. When academics go and they look at corporate PAC money and they try to see is there a difference in roll call votes on bills in Congress for people that got contributions, there's no sort of systematic link between this money and outcomes and who it's targeted to, because the one good thing about the disclosure rules around this is we know who the targets of campaign contributions are. Explicitly which firm PAC spent it, but we can't find outcomes overall, and so we're kind of searching around where the light's shining. But we need to understand the institutional details behind it, right? So this is money, not money from a corporate treasury to a personal bank account. This is what people tend to view this as. It's a little bit more extreme. In reality, this is going into the candidates' campaign coffers, right? So it's limited in how they can use it. It's not like a direct bribe in that sense, and there's subtle differences between what a bribe might look like and what this is. And it's not money from the corporate treasury. So it's money from a corporate political action committee's campaign contributors. And so who can that be is something that's important to understand. So this isn't, again, corporate treasury money can be used related to a PAC. So the law lets this organization that sits outside the firm exist under the premise of free speech, right? And corporate treasury money can be used to administer the existence of it, right? So they can give office space and pay for that. And if you want to send out a communication to members of this restricted class of people, you can use corporate treasury money for that. And that's about where the rules sort of limit the activity. So who can contribute? It's all people who have an interest in the corporation, right? So it's employees, executives, board members, shareholders. But there's this distinction in how you're going to collect money. So you're going to have to convince all these people that it's valuable to actually give money. There's sort of a question of why does a PAC even exist if people can make their direct contributions to the candidates they're interested in anyway if it's free speech, but the idea might be that some other organization could organize it better and put it together. So then the other thing about this is it's not directly a bribe, right? Once the candidate gets the money, it does go to their campaign, it has to be used for election purposes. So you can't, or you get in trouble, right? So there's a guy, I don't have the picture up here, but I forget his name right now. But there was a House rep from Louisiana that was wrapping it up in tinfoil, putting it in his freezer, and presumably doing other stuff with it. Right? That's illegal. You get caught. You get kicked out of office, or we hope that you get caught at least when that happens. And so there are enforcements around the way that this works. And the biggest thing about PAC contributions that's misunderstood in the public is there's actually a really strict limit on this. It's $5,000 per election. As I've been talking about, there are loopholes with everything. So there's actually 2 elections because there's a primary and a general. So the most a company can actually spend if they're within legal limits, and it's really obvious if a company's PAC is within legal limits because there's a direct name and there's only one organization, is $10,000 per election cycle. Right, so that's not a lot of money, and that might actually, in some ways, if you looked at that at face value and you thought that was a binding number, and that cap was going to work, that we might, have influenced reduced firms' ability to extract, rents out of the government, right? So, you can think about this as rent control, not necessarily this type of rent control, where people, want to pay less for where they're living. But, we're at Chicago, people understand econ, and when we think about rent controls, we think about price ceilings, and what does that do? That transfers, who's getting the outcome here, so, it creates a deadweight loss. So what we're going to do is really the demanders of policy are the people who are the renters, right? Or the people who are going to gain the rents. The firms and then the suppliers of policy are the politicians. And so what we're going to do here is we're just going to put this cap on it, and then there's some people who are going to be lucky to get policy outcomes they want in this political marketplace, and other people who aren't, and they're at the cap. That's one thing that could happen. Another way to think about this is to say, well, we know that when rent control happens, in the real world, when we think about, rents in I don't know if anybody's lived in rent-controlled places. I know when I lived in LA, in Santa Monica, I had a rent-controlled apartment, and they just stopped maintaining the place, right? So you move in, the longer you live there, the less maintenance gets done. They tell you that the appliances aren't actually part of the rent, and all of these other things to try to deal with this. And so the quality of outcomes decreases over time, and we end up with, well, how do we effectively charge you more without doing that, right? And so that's one thing that could happen, because if we thought about this in another way, which is, if firms were to sit there and think about politicians and which ones are valuable to them, they'd have some rank order. And most politicians aren't going to be valuable. They're not going to be a marginal voter on anything that a firm cares about. And then, as a politician becomes more valuable, they might be willing to, pay them more to help them with their campaign. And then at some point, they're going to hit this cap. It turns out a lot of firms hit a cap on how much, their PAC contributions are. It's more than half of PAC contributions hit a cap to a given candidate. And when that happens, we see that firms want to spend more money, or you might expect that they'd want to spend more money. And they might be willing to spend a lot more. And there's sort of a question of, okay, how much? And where does that money go? Does that money just not get spent and the cap actually is binding? Or we'd actually see some kind of action beyond that, right? And so when we think about campaign contributions from PACs, we need to realize that they're limited, and firms actually probably have some interest in spending more. And so one way that we can get at a very close match is start looking at campaign contributions from individuals who are tied to firms. And a very easy way to do that is to look at executives. We know executives work at firms, and we can look at them on a variety of different dimensions. So this is all, if anybody in this room makes a campaign contribution for over $200, it gets recorded in the Federal Election Commission's database. And so we can go and we can take their names and addresses of executives, match them up to firms, and start examining what that's done. And so I've done this with my co-authors. You can look at them, over their career, how they behave when they're an executive, when they're not an executive. We can look at them, vis-a-vis candidates who don't accept PAC money. These people actually exist, and don't want to be tied to corporate money. And then we can also look at them, vis-a-vis those limits. And so these are all ways to get at, is there actually money from executives? It's sort of a conduit for corporate money. As background to this, it's technically illegal for a firm to compensate anybody for making campaign contributions, but there's no way to actually separate the two out. So a firm can't compensate you if you make a $5,000 campaign contribution. They couldn't kind of reimburse you for that. But what I'm going to show you is suggestive that individuals are doing this, and that some part of executive compensation, at least, is consistent with an expectation that this is part of the job. So you can look over somebody's career, and so here I've got Paul Anderson, who was the CEO of 2 different energy companies at 2 different periods of time, and these are the dollar amounts he spent on politics, by quarter. And you'll see that when he was the CEO of Pan Energy, he started giving much more consistently than he did prior to that, and then he stops giving for a while, and then he becomes the CEO of Duke Energy, and he starts giving again, right, and giving at much higher amounts. And so this is a pretty consistent pattern across different individuals, and so we know that there's something going on with CEOs, that when they become a CEO, that they start contributing more to campaigns. It's a different way to look at it, which is somebody prior to being a CEO, how much they give when they're an active CEO, and then they sort of retire. They may still have stock options or still be more vested in the firm, and so they continue to give. So while this is good at showing CEOs maybe have some interest, or that when you're an active CEO you might care, it doesn't necessarily kind of complete the whole story, because some of this may actually be driven by politicians. If you become a CEO, that's probably a sign that you're wealthier. If you're a candidate and you're looking for campaign contributions, you may go out and you might start calling these people up, because now they're a high-profile individual who makes lots of money. And so it would be a rational campaign strategy to go and contact these people and ask them. And some of it could still just be driven by, okay, my paycheck went up, and this is still personal or ideological. And so this gets really hard to separate out. We show in our research, this is with Adam Fremeth and Brendan Schaufel, that this isn't driven by increased wealth, and that it's we can't show that it's not driven by politicians looking for wealthy donors, but we can show it's at least not driven by increased. Yeah, Bruno.
How long has been the spending cap of $5,000, $10,000 in place for?
It's been in place since 1971. So the Federal Election Commission Act put that in place.
But the same nominal level?
For corporate PACs, yes. For individuals, there are also caps. Those went in place with BICRA in 2002, and those are indexed to inflation, but corporate PACs aren't. So the same nominal level has been there for corporate linked PACs, but not for individuals since 2002. That's been indexed. Prior to 2002, it was fixed at $1,000. Yeah.
One quick question. Are you going to draw a line between this $5,000 limit affecting presidential elections, $2 billion or spent between the two candidates?
Yeah, we can get there. there's ways to get there. So this is from corporate PACs. So individuals can spend at this point on an individual candidate still only about it's $2,700 I think per election. So double it. Might be 29 now in this cycle, but it's still a small amount from individuals. That doesn't mean that they can't get money from parties. It doesn't mean they can't get money from PACs and these other sources of things too, right? But it takes a lot of donors, right, to run a presidential campaign. Yes.
How much of this is driven by stock options, like in their delta?
For executives.
Yeah.
So there's some evidence, not my research, but somebody else's, that that's more consistent with, or that's consistent with at least some fraction of it. It's really hard to parse out how much is what though we know that the more levered you are, right, or the more you're going to benefit, the more you're likely to make campaign contributions. So there's some expectation, at least among executives, that this stuff's going to work and it's going to do something to increase the value of the firm. And there's good reasons why, as an executive, you might want to give if you are going to go and try to lobby on behalf of a corporation. We'll talk about some of that next time, rather than today. Why you want your name to appear on a donor roll. So I'm happy to take questions at any point too. Yeah.
So I was curious. If I'm a corporation, how is the PAC tied to me? So if it said 5K for a corporation, why don't I just have Google California and Google New York?
So AT&T does this. AT&T has about 8 different PACs. And so you can also set up a structure of multiple PACs. There aren't a lot of firms that do it. But you could have, Google employees in California, Google employees in Chicago, Google employees wherever, and set up separate PACs for those.
You might say I hit the PAC, but you just have to restructure.
Right. So there are ways to restructure around it and get creative to stay within the law. And that's another way that there's more money in politics than might show up as face value coming from a specific firm.
Are there any limits on how aggressively firms can solicit their employees for donations to the PAC or to outside sources? Not that I'm thinking of Google or how aggressively they tend to solicit their employees for campaign contributions.
No, so it's legal for firms to say these are our preferred candidates. This is who we expect our PAC to spend money on. It's legal to even have payroll deduction for money that goes into a PAC.
It's legal for them to give visible stickers or rewards to the employees.
So they can't give anything back that has value
But
for doing it.
For signaling purposes, there's been no legal action from employees about discriminatory practices of firms.
Not that I'm aware of. Technically, they're not allowed to give anything back to employees. That would be, a retaliation type employment claim. I think if something like that were to happen, is it worthwhile for an employee to do? I don't know. Right? That gets tricky too. The other thing that gets tricky with PAC money or even individuals' money is, maybe you just have people sorting into companies, right, who have the same political beliefs and they're going to give to certain types of candidates who are going to benefit the firm because they believe it's going to benefit themselves. And so there's this really fuzzy line, and same thing with executives. Executives might get selected based on their political preferences, and if you don't have the right kind of political donations prior to office, you may not actually become the CEO because you may not have the right connection for certain companies and certain industries that could be incredibly valuable. So there's a fuzzy line there. So another way to get at this question of, a little bit more concretely about what CEO's money is doing and if it's actually on behalf of the firm, right? Because all I can show you before was that there's an increase when somebody becomes a CEO, is to try to figure out, well, what happens if the PAC can't give, right? And so it turns out that, from a research perspective, this is really useful. There's some candidates who have these personal bans against PAC money because they don't want to be seen as being influenceable. So Herb Kohl in Wisconsin was notorious for this, and he was the people's candidate, is how he tried to explain who he was, and so he didn't want to be viewed as corruptible by firms, and kind of ran on that platform. And so what we can do is we can look at, well, what happens to giving around that when a candidate says, I'm going to stop taking money from PACs? Do we see a difference in behavior of CEOs? This is something that's actually seen a resurgence again recently. So there's this thing, Ro Khanna, who represents a district in Silicon Valley, has started up this No PAC caucus, and he's getting more and more names of people who are saying that they're going to refuse to take PAC money, and is trying to institute some campaign finance reform that doesn't allow corporate PACs to exist. Beto O'Rourke, who's challenging Ted Cruz in Texas for the Senate, is part of this too, and kind of big on that. So both of them claim they're not going to take PAC money. It turns out that in practice there are ways around not taking PAC money where you might get corporate money, right? So this looks a lot like what I had before, right? We have this standard story: money comes from corporate PACs, goes into the treasury, but PACs are funded, right? All of the money in a corporate PAC actually comes from individuals, right? So it comes from personal campaign contributions of employees or shareholders. It also comes from executives, and executives can give directly, right? And so, yes.
Are you going to address some of the complaints of householders that claim they have spent 40% time raising money, so they're going to swap this off the campus?
So I'm not going to talk about that directly today, but it is incredibly time-consuming for politicians to raise money. And there are offices, there are legal restrictions on how they can raise money. We're after today the bigger question of, like, how much money is there? Can we quantify it, and where does it leak, rather than what are the consequences of that? So how much money is even spent? So what happens here is you can think of this channel as being cut off, right, directly from PACs to companies, and then take that away. We can all figure out how money still gets from a firm or a firm-linked entity to the PAC, which is just we'd expect an increase in giving along this other channel. And so when you go and you look at the data on this, for candidates who switch off taking PAC money, you see that executives come in and substitute in how much they're giving, and it basically exactly offsets the amount that they're going to lose on the PAC channel. And that's just looking at CEOs, right? You can imagine going down a roster of other executives who might say, well, we still need to influence this politician in some way, and we still want to spend money on politics. And so there's more money that's being spent in these hidden channels, and the effect of the limit or the ban that's supposed to be from people who don't want to be corruptible is that the money just comes from a different place, and that there's sort of a compensation that happens there. So a final way to get at this is thinking about CEOs' personal giving vis-a-vis the PAC limits. Similar type idea, but I showed you this figure before. Right? We've got this limit. We know they might want to give more, and so in instances where a PAC hits a limit to a candidate, we should expect to see an increase in giving. When the PAC's the limit, the amount that a CEO is giving goes up, and it goes up by, it's only a couple $100s, but on average, that's actually about how much the average PAC gives. So next category of money is lobbying, and what is lobbying? So lobbying, again, tends to be more focused on legislative politics. It tends to be about information. An order of magnitude larger is spent on lobbying than on campaign contributions, and so in the latest year, it's about $3.4 billion spent on lobbying. So it's a lot of money, but it's still not enough to solve the Tullock paradox on its own of how much money is in politics. And we've seen a flattening recently, right? So the laws on lobbying are more recent. So the FEC data on campaign contributions dates back to 1971. That's when disclosure laws came into place. For lobbying, was a 1995 law. We don't have data until 1998. And so what this does, this Disclosure Act, is it requires lobbyists to register if they spend more than 20% of their time actually, in a role where they're creating or talking to politicians about information that's relevant to policy. Of course, you could be a lawyer. and a lawyer is not a lobbyist, and there's a fuzzy line in between. And then it also requires that if firms spend a certain amount in a given period of time that they disclose, and the threshold for that is $10,000 per quarter. Maybe it's 5. I'm not sure of that exactly, but so there is limits where you could come in below it. We wouldn't think that these lower spending groups are as influential if money's actually buying the outcomes. At the same time, we don't have complete transparency with lobbying because there's no rules. So with the campaign contributions data, we know exactly how it's spent or sort of on what policies, or not on what policies, but who's targeted. On lobbying disclosures, there's no rules about who's targeted. And you can fill in very vague things about what you lobbied on. So you're asked, you could say something like taxes, but you could be lobbying to raise taxes or lower taxes. And if you're looking at a firm, probably lowering taxes on something specific to the firm or changing some specific element of the tax code related to a firm. We know that lobbying is effective, unlike campaign contributions on average from the academic research, but we actually don't know the full extent of it because trade associations are a big part of how firms might lobby, particularly smaller firms, and the disclosure rules don't allow us to identify who's a member of what trade association. So if you wanted to figure out and narrow in on a particular firm, we can't do that. Plus, we know that there are other lists of people who act in a lobbying capacity and say that they do public policy on behalf of firms, and there are registries of these. And so there's a guy, Trey Thomas, who was a PhD student at UT, and Tim Lapira went and they put together, basically matched those records to who was in the lobbying disclosure database, and only 52% of the people who are in this sort of phone book of lobbyists actually show up in the official lobbying disclosures. So we know there are a lot of people doing this who aren't registered. We know that some of them are prominent people. Newt Gingrich is like a very prominent individual who is a lobbyist but isn't a lobbyist. There's a question, about Tom Daschle, if he's a lobbyist or not. So some prominent, former politicians are in there. But even people who are lower level in the bureaucracy, or there's reasons why you may not want to have to fill out disclosure reports. And this doesn't work like a well-oiled auditing machine. Where we still know that there are problems in kind of financial accounting world. This is much looser in terms of how we enforce lobbying. So there's a lot of people hired in the shadow as kind of consultants that know something about the political process, and as long as they don't actually interact with people, they don't have to register. It's legal to do this, and so we know there's a lot of kind of leaks around the edges there. We also know that if this is targeted at campaigns, similar graph to before, that firms are going to spend about another $500,000 on lobbying if they hit the cap on any one PAC contribution. So we'll see more money. It's probably electoral money that's maybe miscategorized too, simply because we've got these different categories of spending. They're supposed to be informative about something, like how much money is spent on electoral politics, how much is spent on legislative politics, and there's some blurry line in between because we know that when firms did want to spend more on electoral politics, they ended up spending more on legislative. So how could that work? That could work through seconding lobbyists to go work on campaigns and not getting paid to do that, but getting paid in some other capacity. It could work by providing information that's relevant to the campaign. A lobbyist can provide information about polling in a district that a politician's running in. So this is going to contribute to an incumbency advantage potentially too, if that type of thing's existing, because you get this extra subsidy that can only go to somebody who's in office. They can't go to a candidate on the other side of things. Charitable donations. So this is sort of the newest area and something that I'm going to show you this limit figure again. And what I can tell you is that if for PACs that hit the limit, they spend an enormous amount more on charitable contributions. They increase their charitable contributions by almost 70%. It's a little bit cautious that that's fully designed to help politicians or targeted at politicians. Even newer research than the stuff that I've done has been done here by Marianne Bertrand, and then Francisco Trebi used to be here, and some other co-authors where they went and they took 990 data, which is IRS data on charitable foundations, and saw where that money went. And they can show that about 7% of money that comes from corporate foundations, charities, looks like it could be politically motivated. And it's politically motivated in that, who that firm's PAC is contributing to looks like the same people that the charity is contributing to, or it's targeted at politicians who regulate firm statistics. And so, overall, they end up coming up with a sort of a back of the envelope estimate that there's about 50% of the amount of money that's spent on lobbying is charitable contributions actually spent on political influence. And so we know this is another channel for corporate spending. Again, back to the other channels, like Citizens United existed, right? It allowed companies to spend money from corporate treasuries, but this isn't the only way to spend money on politics. There's all these other channels. You may actually prefer spending money through a charity or other ways. So there's all these other alternative channels that existed. Citizens United is maybe not the problem if we get to this point, and sure, we don't have transparency, but it didn't open up floodgates to money, which was what the media talked about, was that it was going to open up floodgates to money. So just only opened one more channel. A colleague of mine at UT did an event study around this and firms that were big campaign contributors before, and what the effect of Citizens United was. There's no change in firms' valuations if they were heavy campaign spenders prior to this court decision or not, which suggests that the market at least didn't believe that the big political spenders were going to start spending more through this kind of more hidden money channels. So there's at least maybe no benefit to doing it that way, particularly given all these other channels existed. That amount of money was out there because we're kind of in this leaky world where we can't properly sort of account for or control how much money is in politics. Yes?
Could you argue, though, that Citizens United, rather than open the floodgates to more money, just lower the risks of all the other PAC channels? Because if you're not getting caught, there's a Supreme Court decision that says, no, it's fine, you can actually spend enough money this way. So it's less about the financial rather than the...
Yeah, so it certainly created another back channel. You would, in your story, you'd expect firms to still benefit from that if the politically active firms were spending more money. If anything, it decreased transparency. And I think transparency is in the background of everything that I'm talking about today, and actually where we're going to go next is the transparency issue.
So I thought the big effect was on transparency, because if I'm a rich individual and I want to donate to a campaign without being seen,
Yep.
I create a corporation, I donate through the corporation, and that's not visible.
That's right. So the biggest effect is on transparency. When you look at the public and you look at the media that came out immediately after Citizens United, it was about the amount of money, and it was that it was going to unleash all this money. And so it's pretty clear that it hasn't unleashed new money. It's just transferred the way that we would account for it, right, into this new category. Arguably, it's a less efficient category too if you have to do this, kind of fake non-coordination, right, to coordinate without coordinating, and there's all sorts of stories if you go into the media about how this is done, and how they're signaling back and forth, and Twitter accounts that have numbers in them and stuff that you're supposed to respond to. But it doesn't. So we don't know where the money is spent, and it's not clear that a company could spend money better than a political consultant inside a campaign. And
why the way to fix the problem isn't to be more aggressive in enforcing this independence? Because if they locate in the same building, it's hard to say that they are independent.
I think that's one way to solve it. I think transparency is a bigger way to solve it, if you're asking me, which is where we're about to go. So there's other conduits beyond this too, beyond citizens. Well, I'll take a question. So
I mean, under the presumption that we're not coordinating at all, you have to know that I gave did the outside spending for me to actually deliver.
To get a benefit,
Yeah,
right?
like if I deliver the outside money, maybe I change the probabilities, but you have to know I gave you a bribe.
That's right, and it has to be communicated in some way where you could say that you did that afterwards, and it would be uncoordinated, right? And be in a politician's office and say, hey, I spent $5 million running these ads in your district. And the politician may say, well, those ads really didn't help me. Those weren't the issue I wanted to talk about, and they derailed me into talking about some other issue, or they may say they did help me. We don't know, and so there's some other risk involved in that. It's at least not an efficient way to spend money, and it's untransparent. So if we're really trying to monitor this.
Attack the other candidate. So if I spend money attacking your rival, I'm certainly benefiting you, and I don't need to coordinate and just trash the other rival.
It depends on how you attack the rival. So there's even instances of politicians being upset about how the rivals were attacked, because then it changes the issue agenda. So, if you attack the rival on one thing, then the rival comes back and attacks on something that, ends up becoming a distraction. And so politicians lose some control, even if the PAC, the super PAC, or the independent expenditure money is spent trying to benefit a politician. It may not work the way the politicians, strategists had sort of planned to run their campaign. And they may start having to talk about other things or make promises on things they didn't have to before, because even through an attack, you shift the agenda of what's being talked about a little bit.
Do you know this Stratman and Barrett study that really the event study with Citizens United, and basically they say that okay, there's no effect on firms that lobby, but there's firms that's an effect on firms that sponsor a PAC, a PAC. So do you know about this study? Like
Apparently I don't. Is this a JLE one? We should talk about this after too. Okay. Apparently I don't know that result or haven't seen that result in that way. So there's ways this could work or couldn't work. For understanding the Tullock paradox here, the point is, and how much money there is in politics, that we're never really fully going to know because there are all these conduit channels, and transparency is a big thing that gets obscured with all these different regulations around things, and we've got firms and individuals trying to find all the loopholes in everything possible, and so we have a much sort of, we have no way to account for this, right? There's fuzzy boundaries. If we're trying to understand corporate influence of what's personal, what's corporate, and then regulation, if anything, is driving activity underground, right? So into channels that, like charitable contributions, where we wouldn't even necessarily think of those as corporate motivated or politically motivated in the first place. It's also driving sort of this fuzziness around what's what. If we're interested in, are they influencing elections? Some of that money may be going through lobbying, not just campaign contributions, and et cetera. So we end up with a kind of a mass of data and transparency. And for my thoughts, I think that some of why there's actually so much anger around Citizens United is it's misplaced, focusing on the amount of money, and really it's sort of transparency is the bigger problem because we don't know how it's being spent. We don't know if an individual is actually being targeted by anything, and that's what we would be concerned about if we cared about kind of the marginal policy. And so at some level, looking at this aggregate debate, it's useful for helping to frame and think about money in politics, but it's not going to help us solve the things that people are really upset about, which are digging in at a deeper level. Yes?
I think maybe part of the problem is there's so many complexities to how to give that it actually obfuscates the problem. Instead of having a law, that it's like one-page law that says you can't do this, you can't do that. I see this in legislation.
Yep.
You want to obfuscate the problem, they make it very complex. You have 8 pages of written regulations.
For sure. So, anytime you end up with a funny regulation, right, which the way that money in politics is regulated is very strange. You want to think about, who's that trying to protect? The more complicated the law looks, the harder it is to implicate the politicians who are actually writing the law in this instance, who maybe are trying to protect themselves. That's probably one of the reasons why lobbying money in particular doesn't sort of have a target for who the politicians were. They probably learned that there are media stories that get written about them on campaign contributions and didn't want that to happen again. I mean, that's my best guess. I don't know. Different countries regulate lobbying in different ways, and we have different disclosure rules, but there's almost nowhere where you end up with money and targets, at the same time. And so by putting the focus on money, you put the focus on the interest groups more than on the politicians. And certainly if I were a politician trying to regulate myself, I wouldn't want to be implicated if I could be.
I'll give you an example afterwards.
Okay. So, I think a big problem is transparency, or the bigger problem with money in politics is actually transparency and how it's spent, what type of politics it's actually spent on. Taking this back to the Tullock paradox, we can take all this, and in some ways we can say maybe even it's 10% larger, than the amount of money in politics that we think exists, and then we still end up with a 50% return, which is still probably too high, right, in Tullock's world. Even if there were 10 times more money in politics than we can actually observe and add up, it's still a 50% return. So we haven't fully solved it, or we can't fully solve it by trying to find all these hidden channels of money and by bringing everything out and being fully transparent. So there must be something else going on. What's going on in the numerator here of what government benefits are, or what government benefits would be, is something we're going to talk about next time. Sort of sources of non-monetary influence that corporations have. So today we talked a lot about kind of how economists view things and capture, and we're over here in this world of firms and politicians and money going back and forth. We forget that politicians actually have another relational contract on the other side of things, which works with their constituents. And so political scientists tend to think more over there, and this is a great thing the Stigler Center does, is sort of interdisciplinary academic work, and a good thing to be around here for that reason. And so we can talk more next time really about kind of the political science side of where what's constraining politicians, right, and why they may not actually be able to give out benefits to every firm and how that works. And so we want to kind of bridge the two if we want to understand these relationships better. So I'm open for questions for the last 10 minutes here, as promised, on anything. Yeah.
I think that in the U.S. Yeah. Thank you. In the U.S., I see a lot of debate about not much debate about how the candidates are spending the money in campaigns. That is the other side of the equation. For example, regulation on or even ban of ads, political ads in television. That's something that happens in other countries. Or to establish of 3 minutes in television for the candidates. Do you see that this kind of measure could be a way to limit the need for the candidates to amount such big amount of money to run a competitive campaign, and in this way curb the influence of corporation in politics?
So, I mean, there is sort of a public financing option that some states have had in state-level elections in the U.S. I actually don't know a whole lot about that, but certainly if they could raise a competitive amount of money from a public financing option or limits on how much advertising they could do, it would shut off those channels. I think in the world we live in today, it's increasingly difficult to regulate advertising, and this is the whole kind of Facebook, social media world. What even is advertising becomes a fuzzier question. TV ads aren't the only way politicians are doing this anymore, and to that extent, I think it probably becomes a lot harder. But
still, I understand that much of the money is spent in television ads. No?
What's that?
That much. I understand that still in this new environment, much of the money of the campaigns is still in television ads. No.
I think that's right, but I don't know exactly how all politicians are spending money, and there's certainly politicians that are starting to do things in different ways, the media and information environment has changed a lot in the last couple of years. That I wouldn't be surprised if television ads don't stay the predominant source of campaign spending. Are there ways to limit other things? Potentially, but I think the world's getting more complicated, and it's harder to regulate that at all.
I'm sure you know all this, but just to sort of flag in terms of looking more broadly at some of the lack of transparency issues, or both in terms of the fund giving or fundraising, and then the spending that Daniel mentioned. I mean, there's the whole area of bundling, right? So,
right.
So you may not maybe only give $5,000, but if you're a bundler, and that was big in their presidential campaigns, you can claim credit for having raised several $100,000 or more than $1 million, and so that is a way of amplifying your giving. And also, in terms of how the politicians spend it, I mean, there's these so-called leadership PACs where, you get a lot of influence by getting a ton of money and giving it to people, spreading that around. And I just wonder whether you've factored those into your models to sort of expand the spending and the usage influence questions.
So I haven't looked at any of those explicitly, but they add to what makes this complicated to get to specific outcomes from firms, because it gets very hard to quantify how much the specific firms spent, especially with leadership PACs, which are, if you're a politician, you can have a PAC that gives money to other politicians' PACs. And so you may be indirectly influencing somebody by giving to one politician's PAC and they're giving to another, and everybody knows that's what's happening. And so this stuff happens, bundling happens, but it's really hard to quantify all these things because they're done to obfuscate. And so the transparency issue is real in those spaces too.
I guess, do you have a sense of how much of the free riding problem might be involved in whether or not corporations donate money to political campaigns, in that, like, maybe one of the reasons why corporations don't give as much money is because the policies that would be eventually instituted, benefit the entire industry or certain industries, and therefore, the return is much smaller in CEOs' minds or corporate minds.
Sure. So, I mean, this is a real problem. I mean, we end up in the data with things that look very consistent with the free riding problem exists. Bigger firms are more likely to be the ones that contribute, right? If you're a smaller firm, you may not contribute, or you may not lobby because you believe that the bigger firms are going to do some things that are going to benefit you. We also, have scant data on trade associations. To the extent that you can start looking at that, we don't know who members of every trade association are. We don't know what the fees are to be part of a trade association. Some trade associations list their members. You can figure out who members of pharma are versus who the big pharmaceutical companies, for instance, right? And I've done that. You can put together that data, and there's this sense that pharma is this big, and they spend more money on lobbying than almost any other trade association. They're certainly in the top 20. But the individual members of pharma spend a lot more money on their own than they do through the trade association, even if you assumed, like, when you aggregate those up. So we don't know how many trade associations Pfizer is a member of, and can't fully back that out of, are they spending more money on their own or with other groups. And so this gets really tricky, but we wouldn't expect that firms would spend money on their own, aside from a trade association, unless their interests deviated from the industry in some way. And when you're thinking about political policy or policies that you want as a firm and how you're going to lobby, ideally, as a political strategist for a firm, you want to narrow in on what's heterogeneous about your firm that can get coded into law, and the law can create very specific, narrow benefits. So an example of that is, the tax bill just passed. Everybody thinks this is great for all corporations. If you go back and you look at tax changes, we know there's a relationship between lobbying and taxes. You can get very specific things written into law. There's something that I found in some of my research on NASCAR racetracks and accelerated depreciation. If you build a NASCAR racetrack in a 3-year window, to build a NASCAR racetrack that's going to bring a couple 100,000 people to a certain location, you need all sorts of municipal approvals that take a lag time. It takes a long time to actually build this thing, and to get accelerated tax depreciation on that. It only applies to one firm. Surprisingly, there are actually 3 firms that build NASCAR racetracks. I didn't know that until trying to figure this out, but the only firm that lobbied was the one who happened to build a NASCAR racetrack during that 3-year window, right? And so you can write legislation in ways where it benefits only one firm, and those are the instances where it probably makes sense to go lobby on your own. Getting at that question is still a very unresolved, academic problem, though.
Is there any way to estimate what amount of these contributions are for philosophical purposes versus some business purpose?
It gets really tricky. So I think the answer is no. I mean, we don't know how much money from a corporate PAC even could be ideological, when some of it could be, right? We tend to assume that corporate PAC money is strategic on behalf of the firm. It could be that everybody shares the same interests, and this is why they want to give to certain politicians. And that might be one of the reasons why there are, kind of no returns to firms on campaign contributions, at least when we look at roll call votes on bills. You can see earlier in the process, maybe it matters in terms of, do you get something out of committee is maybe more likely if you've made campaign contributions. But some of them are certainly made for ideological purposes, and separating that's a really tough question. In which case, we'd have the number the wrong way, right? I mean, we'd have a smaller amount of money that's corporate influence money in politics, and we'd have an even bigger return. So trying to be generous to this problem and figuring out the answer to it, if we're focused on the denominator here, that goes in the other direction. It means that there should be even more corporate money in politics.
I was wondering, you talked about obviously what PAC can do in like a direct election, but they also have kind of a fund for party building activities. I was wondering if anybody looked at, if I hit the cap on my campaign contributions, do I also basically use the party building activities as a kind of soft fund for basically funding the same campaign?
So I don't know anybody who's done that explicitly. I mean, using these caps on PAC limits is sort of a newer strategy to try to figure out where money's going. But I'm not aware of that research.
Sorry.
I wouldn't be surprised if it exists, or if the effect exists. The research, I don't think does. Rena.
So if you look online, you see a lot of reference to the explosion of dark money.
Yep.
Can you give us some quick explanation definition of how that works? Like, what do people refer to when they talk about dark?
When people talk about dark money, they tend to be talking about independent expenditures and money where it goes through a conduit, so you don't have to have a list of donors. So some super PAC money, there is a list of donors. That's not dark money, and then there's other ways to set up, a layer of obfuscation, essentially. So you set up one charity that takes donations and pass it along to another. I don't know all the details of it, but dark money basically refers to you don't know who the donor is.
So you set up an entity that obfuscates basically, who are the individual donors, because we're still talking about individual donors, right?
That's right. And so, the individual donors, one of why is there so much money in aggregate type of question, and you hear the names Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson, and people point at these people. These people are rich people because they were affiliated with corporations, right? Is the money that they're spending on campaigns ideological, to that question, or is it in the corporate interests? Isn't fully clear. I mean, there's some money that the Koch brothers spend in some issues where it seems like it actually goes kind of in the opposite direction of what Koch industries might want. There's other times when, you look at some of the positions on climate change and they don't seem fully consistent with their ideological beliefs on other things, but seem more consistent with industry reasons. And so, even for those people, it's murky. Like where some of the money may be corporate and linked, and some of it may not. And certainly, their political views have been the same for a long time. At least if you look at it. And so, are they in an industry that aligns with their political views because of that? This is why this question about ideology is so tricky. But they have money because of corporations, but it doesn't mean everything they're doing goes in the same direction. Yes?
What do you think the impact would be on transparency and PAC donations if you just remove caps on individual contributions to campaigns?
So we estimated that in one of our papers, what we think would happen in terms of the total amount of money going towards electoral politics, not politics in general. But I don't think there would be necessarily a huge increase in the total amount of money in politics. I think we'd see a little bit less lobbying and a shift from lobbying over to campaign contributions. And I forget how much we didn't toy with getting rid of the limit overall. That's almost impossible to sort of estimate, even in a back-of-the-envelope way. But even increasing the limit, doubling the limit, we weren't going to get a whole lot more money in politics. But I think if you did that in a way that enforced transparency, I think we would have at least a better system for accounting for money in electoral politics. And then we'd know exactly which candidates were getting what money. And we wouldn't end up with all these back channels. I think people would be upset about it. And I think it's very hard to communicate that this other stuff went underground, and how politicians would justify doing that, I think would be very complicated. But I think if we wanted to know what's going on, we'd have a much better sense of what's going on if we got rid of limits and we're a little bit tighter on the transparency and kind of enforcement side of things. Of lobbyists can't run polls in somebody's district and give that to a politician, right? That is for a campaign contribution to be spent on, and that's something that a lobbyist is restricted from doing. That's going to be something that's really hard to enforce, and so if you can enforce these things, that would probably be a better system for at least categorizing and knowing how the money is set up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think behind you, I haven't heard from.
So candidates, politicians on one side of an issue get donations. Politicians on the other side of the issue also get donations.
That's right.
Has anything that you've worked on given you any sense of how much of a differential it takes in order to get what you want?
So there are people that give to both sides. When you look at CEOs giving, you'd think that maybe they're ideologically oriented and they give only to one side or the other. I want to say, I don't know the number. I'd have to look it up in the paper, but it's somewhere around 80% of CEOs give to both parties, even within the same election cycle. Right, so there's a lot of there's not this giving to one side or another. You'll see corporate PACs will give to both candidates in a race sometimes, in the same district, and so this happens, even within donors. How much of a differential you need depends on a lot of things we'll talk about next time too. But what are constituents going to do? Probably changes the price that you'd have to pay to get an outcome, and how far a politician can deviate from their constituents and what their constituents want. is a real constraint on politicians, right? If their main objective is to get reelected, money's not necessarily the only thing that's going to help them get reelected. And so it's not clear that it's a consistent price differential that you'd need or a consistent amount, but that's going to vary depending upon the politician.
You talked about transparency. So what's the takeaway for us to go back to our congressmen and senators? What can we demand in terms of two things they can do in demanding more transparency? That seems to be the main leitmotif in your.
So I think as long as we have caps, the transparency is not actually very helpful. So I think we want transparency as a policy solution, but it's you're kind of running a gamble if you try to say we need both of these things, right? Because then you need to somehow communicate that the caps are one of the things that's driving a lack of transparency, because that's pretty clear that that's part of what's going on. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you ask for it in a way other than saying we need a wholesale change in the system where we're going to define what the fuzzy boundary is between lobbying and campaign contributions, and we don't want to limit, and we want to know what this is, and we want to know.
This is a room of 50 congressmen. What would you tell them?
This is a room of 50 congressmen?
No, if you were in a room like this, but there were 50 congressmen.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm trying to get a better public policy around disclosure of, so I think we would also have some sort of consolidated disclosure across different types of corporate political spending. And the SEC has toyed with this idea and making it something that appears on accounting statements. It hasn't gotten anywhere, but having some sort of consolidated disclosure. So we'd want some kind of consolidated disclosure. We'd want clear definitions of what lobbyists can't do in terms of what types of information they can provide, because it's campaign relevant. I don't think we'd want the ability to have dark money or independent expenditures where we can't track that. And to the extent that firms were making independent expenditures, we want that on their consolidated disclosures, what districts these things are in. Nobody's going to go through all this data at once. Right now there's 4 or 5 different government data sets we need to go through to try to put this stuff together, right? And it's complicated in a patchwork.
A one-stop shop.
But a one-stop shop would help a lot, and clearer definitions of boundaries. And I think actually getting rid of the limits, because the limits are distortionary in terms of where money gets spent, and creating this fuzziness around the edges between different types of money.
So I would go exactly the opposite way. Why don't you say voluntary? He said what you can ask to senators or congressmen who run, and the answer is they should self-impose a limit. I don't take donation for more than $1,000 or $2,000. All donation across every board, not just corporate donation, but independent expenditure, super PAC, whatever. And it's just that's to some extent what Bernie Sanders did. He put a limit, and that would change the game dramatically if this was more widespread.
Yeah, but if the limit exists and there are ways around it, right? So you can do the charitable contribution thing to the politician's district, right? And it's going to benefit their constituents. And there's always going to be a way around a limit.
But this is the hydraulic theory that sort of money flows like water. I think that there is some friction in a sense. Even the paper by Marianne, yes, you can some of the thing, but it's not as big, and then you can act on a different dimension. But if voluntarily the candidate, so some candidates, as you say no corporate PAC, but that's useless because they get individual donations of $1 million. So even if it's not a corporate PAC, but what does so the real limit is saying no donation above X, and we cannot impose by law because of the Supreme Court decision, but voluntarily you can do that. And so I think that as voters, that's what we should ask our representative.
I don't think that would necessarily be a bad way to do it if everybody did it. How you get politicians to do that when everybody's not going to vote for somebody. I mean, campaign finance is an interesting political issue too. If you ask people, they tend to say it's like one of the top 5 things that needs to be reformed. But then if you ask them any questions about, do you know anything about money in politics, they can't tell you what a PAC is. They can't tell you, where any of the money is being spent. They can't tell you that there are limits on it in an existing sense. And so,
But this is like saying unemployment is number one problem, not now, but you don't know where unemployment is why. People don't know the technical details, but I don't think they got it wrong, the picture.
Well, I think we don't have the whole picture. I mean, I think this is part of the problem is we don't have the whole picture because we don't know where money actually goes. All we know is that as long as these other channels exist, that we won't have the whole picture, and we'll never have the whole picture, and so we'll never know how much money there actually is in politics or targeted at a specific politician. And we would like that whole picture. Sure, we might want that whole picture in a way where everybody can give the same amount. We'll also talk next time a little bit about firm size and why firm size may have nothing to do with money. Because if I'm a politician and which firms I might want information from in the first place, there still could be a bias in that too. So even if you're giving the same amount of money as everybody else, it may be cheaper relatively for you to do as a larger firm, or you may just have more relevant information to a politician at their firm. So we'd still have influence even without money. If we banned all money whatsoever, and that's largely what we're going to talk about next time is how do you have influence without money? Because that's sort of what the numerator in that return puzzle is. I think we're about 10 minutes over. I don't know how long we have. Thank you.